All right, picking up where we left off, starting over again. It's a new day for me, though, I have to say. So my beer has been replaced by coffee, and the lights have been replaced by the sunshine. Here we go, picking up where we left off. Mutually constitutive correlates. Mutually constitutive correlates, MCCs. We'll be talking about these all semester. It's an important concept for you to wrap your head around. What are mutually constitutive correlates? Well, mutually constitutive correlates, let's get our heads around that. So, as we already said, and so said in the last segment, signifiers are intellectual divisions created by the mind, right? We saw this all the way back to that Zen Buddhist monk who was saying, that zero helps us to erase those intellectual divisions caused by the mind by grounding ourselves in the now, in the temporal moment. Signifiers, any signifier, are just simply intellectual divisions. They're things that we've made up in order to signify or point to or signify entities in the world, such as the cup, right? So this is just a collection of atoms, right? It's just a collection of atoms and molecules that someone formed into this particular shape, right? By the way, why can't you trust an atom? Because they make everything up. So this is made up of atoms, right? It's entirely made up of atoms. But my hand is also made up of atoms, right? So we call this thing a cup. We use the word cup as a signifier, which refers to this particular collection of atoms, not necessarily because of its form or its shape, but because of its function that it can perform, right? It can perform the function of being a cup. But in reality, it's just a collection of atoms, right? There's no cupness here. It's not like you took a bunch of atoms and then added some cupness, right? It's just atoms. There's nothing but atoms here. I could squash this and it would no longer be a cup, but matter and energy can either be created or destroyed, but just transformed from one form into another. So it would still be the same, matter and energy, the same collection of atoms, but it would no longer have cupness, right? So cupness isn't something that exists out in the world. Cupness is something that exists only in our minds. It's a signifier. The word is a signifier that is created by our minds to distinguish the cup from, like the inside of the cup or the outside of the cup or the hand upon which the cup rests, right? So these signifiers are used to distinguish between the cup, these atoms that we refer to by that signifier, and everything that's not it, right? So the cup only exists or stands out in opposition to everything that is not that, right? A, not A. Therefore, signifiers are mutually constitutive correlates. They are intellectual divisions. Think about it. Anytime you divide something, right? If you have something and you divide it or you cut it, then you're dividing it into two, right? And when you divide it into two things, then there are two things, right? So likewise, signifiers, by dividing reality into logical conceptual, using the law of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle, then we can see then any signifier then is a mutually constitutive correlate. It causes that thing, that idea, that signification to come into being, but also its opposite, that from which it is distinguished, right? So the process of signifying things is a way to divide reality, which is just made up of atoms and energy and that sort of thing, into particular concepts that we can think about with the mind, and those intellectual divisions arise with one another. Cup and not cup. A, not A. Red, not red. Right? Let's think of some other ones. What about a circle? Whenever you draw a circle, we've defined a circle as an infinite series of dimensionless points equidistant from a single dimensionless point. So anytime we have a circle, by definition, there has to be a center to that circle, because the circle is the infinite series of dimensionless points equidistant from a center point. So you have to have both the center and the circumference in order to constitute a circle. But by definition, the center of the circle and the circumference of the circle are opposites, right? But you can't have one without the other. You can't have a circle unless there's both a center and a circumference. So even though center and circumference are opposites, they're mutually arising. You can't have one without the other. They depend on one another for their existence. So let's give a definition of MCCs, or mutually constitutive correlates. They are intellectual opposites, A not A, red not red, cup not a cup, whatever. Intellectual opposites that arise together or coincidentally. They arise in the same incident, the incident in which their origin, they find their origin or their creation is dependent on one another. They're coincidental. They arise together and therefore are ontologically depend upon one another for their existence, right? Intellectual opposites that arise together or coincidentally or simultaneously and therefore are ontologically dependent upon one another. Therefore, ontologically depend on one another for their existence. That's actually a little bit redundant, but they depend on one another for their existence. Again, in Sanskrit, this is pratitya samutpada. These things mutually arise. You can't have one without the other. You can't have the zero, right? The zero draws a circle around nothing, thereby distinguishing that nothing from all the other nothings, from everything else. Therefore, creating a binary, a duality of inside and outside. Inside the nothing inside the zero and the nothing outside of the zero. Or even the zero itself, right? The circle itself. So these are things that arise together. Now I know this can feel a little bit abstract. It was more than a little bit abstract. It's quite abstract. So let's try and make it a little bit more concrete. Let's think about parenting. I think about parenting a lot since I'm a single dad. And so parenting. Well, I obviously, hope it's obvious, I existed, I was Brad, before I had kids, right? So before my daughter Leela was born, I was just Brad, right? I wasn't a father, I wasn't a dad, I was just Brad. But as soon as Leela was born, as soon as my child was born, I became a parent, right? So parent and child are not the same thing. I am not my child. I am the parent of my child. Now I am a child because I have parents, but that's a different relationship, right? So the relationship between me as father and my daughter as child is mutually arising. You can't have one without the other. So in order to have a parent must arise in contradiction to child. Probably instead of thinking about this in terms of A and not A, it may be helpful to think about it in a slightly different metaphor of center and circle, right? The child and the parent. They arise together. You can't be a parent unless there is a child, right? You can't be a child unless there is a parent. Parent and child arise together. At no point, so if I were to say, which was born first, my daughter or, well, that didn't really work. Which was born first, the child or the parent? You would have to say, well, they were born together. Because prior to the birth of the child or prior to the existence of the child, I'm not talking about that whole where life begins and does life begin at conception and all that kind of stuff. That's not our topic right now. But by the way, since I brought it up, to say that life begins at conception just seems odd to me, because then it would imply, doesn't it? Well, it doesn't, just more than implies that the sperm is not alive and that the egg is not alive, but it seems to me that the sperm is very much alive. So I don't understand the whole life begins at conception, because it seems like there was life there before conception, and after conception there's just some sort of transformation or a uniting, a coming together of two. Anyway, so parent and child are mutually constitutive correlates. You can't have one without the other. What about siblings? Like if you have a sibling, let's say you are an older sibling, right? So you existed, you were who you are prior to the birth of your younger sibling. But you only became a sibling at the exact same time that your sibling became a sibling, right? So siblings are mutually arising. You can't have one without the other. They arise together, and you are always siblings together, right? Now, all this may seem pointless to you. I mean, I'm struggling always to emphasize why these things matter, why I'm teaching you, why I'm choosing to talk about these things, and why I consider this to be such an important part. sort of preparation and critically important philosophical tools in order to study religion, theology, etc. One reason is that since all signifiers are intellectual divisions created by the mind, then we need to think about some of the most important signifiers, particularly those mutually constitutive correlates that are right at the heart of logic and understanding and our encounter, our experience of reality, our experience of the external world. And the duality that comes to mind as being especially critically important and right at the heart of the phenomenological method is the relationship between subject and object. Now, the relationship between subject and object are mutually constitutive correlates. You cannot have one without the other. They define one another. They are divisions created by the mind that arise together or coincidental with one another. You can't have a subject unless there is some object, and an object is by definition an object only with respect to a subject. For example, I'm thinking of something right now that's in this room that I know it's not as effective since we're not in the same room, but there's something in this room right now that I am thinking of, and because I am thinking of it is an object of my it is an object of my consciousness, right? It is not an object of your consciousness, because you don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Probably don't know what the hell I'm talking about usually, but you don't even know the object that I'm talking about. But it's not an object for you at this moment. It is only an object of my consciousness. As soon as I point it out, right, like the Buddha's pointing finger, as soon as I point to it and indicate what I am pointing out, then it becomes an object of your consciousness, right? So in this case, I'm talking about the light switch. So now, as soon as I point to the light switch and say the word light switch, then you know what I'm talking about. Then that light switch becomes an object of your subjective consciousness, right? So it was not an object prior to, well, for you, it was not an object prior to my identifying it and prior to its becoming an object of your consciousness. But as soon as I point to it and say, that's an object, and then I draw your attention to it so that you're thinking about the light switch, then the light switch becomes an object of your consciousness, because being an object only arises coincidental with an intellectual division created by the mind, which is the subjective mind, right? So the subjective mind turns that light switch, which is just a collection of atoms and molecules, whatever, that are on the wall, not bothering anybody, nobody's thinking about it until I draw your attention to it. Then as soon as I draw your attention to it, then it becomes an object of your consciousness. So it becomes an object with respect to a subject. So subject and object are mutually constitutive correlates. Now this may not seem radical, but it is something that people like Rene Descartes just didn't quite understand. And it's really important for us now to try and understand some of these things so that we don't make the same mistakes that have been made by white men over the past couple hundred years. All right, let's think about the word exist. We've already talked about fundamental ontology in the previous sections and various ways of existing, different meanings of the word being, right? Luke, I am your father, as opposed to the lotus is blue, or this is a cup, or you know, Mr. Ping saying to Poe, I am your father, or being his father, right, through his actions and that sort of thing. Formal ontology, functional ontology, qualitative ontology, temporal active ontology, all those kind of things that we talked about before. But we haven't talked specifically about this word, exist, right? So exist is another way of saying that something is, right? If it exists, then it is. It has some being, right? If it is, then it exists. But what do we mean by this word exist? So think about the relationship between this word exist and mutually constitutive correlates, or the idea that signifiers are always intellectual divisions created by the mind in order to divide physical material reality into various intellectual conceptual divisions, right, which signify reality in a way that can often obscure reality by turning, like the same way that zero turns a nothing into a something. Likewise, signifiers can have an effect, right? If we refer to people using certain words, or we, label people or divide people up into, ethnicities or gender or sexual orientation or nationality or those sort of things, then we're taking things that exist and then we're placing intellectual divisions on top of those collections of atoms or cells. But all of that's just creations of the mind, right? But let's go back to this word exist. So the word exist comes from the Latin ek, meaning out, and sistere, meaning to stand, right? To exist is literally to exist is literally to stand out. What does that mean, to stand out? What does it mean to stand out? What are some of the ways that you can stand out? Well, you can't stand out unless there is something from which you stand out, right? You can stand out from something, right? So I am like part of if there are a line of people here and then I stand out, then I'm standing out from the line of people, right? Or if I am up against the wall, then if I were wearing entirely black, then, maybe I wouldn't stand out from the wall. But if I'm wearing, red and these kind of colors, then I stand out from the wall, right? So in order to stand out, you have to stand out from something else. Likewise, by drawing a circle around nothing, then we cause this nothing to stand out from all of the other nothings, right? That's in the case of zero. But in any other signifier, likewise, the first three laws of logic, even according to Aristotle, are that A must stand out from not A. So as soon as we define anything, then it stands out from everything else, which then comes into existence and gets this new label of not being that, right? Think about it like this. What if we talked earlier about red, and the opposite of red is not red? And so what causes red to exist? Well, part of what causes it, let's think, if all light in the entire universe, or all light that we had any experience with, if all light was between 625 and 740 nanometers in wavelength, if all light was that, then would we call anything red? Or would it make any sense to say that all light is red? If all light is red, then no light is red, right? The light being red, it only makes sense to say that red is red because it stands out from the other colors, right? Red only makes sense because it is not blue, not yellow, not orange, not indigo, not violet, not whatever, right? So red stands out, or red exists over and against its opposite, which is always going to be not red, right? So what? Well, I can tell you from lots of experience that one of the things that most students in the classroom do not want me to call them out, right? They don't want me to call their name in class, or, especially put them on the spot, or what professors call cold calling, just calling on somebody, completely without any warning or anything like that. One of the reasons, or even just saying students' names, when I am in the classroom, I will very frequently say students' names, particularly if they're like dozing or, a little bit, you can tell when people aren't paying attention. And I'll call their names out and I'll say Bob or Susie or whatever, right? I'll call their name out. And that calling out, the reason people are uncomfortable with that is because it causes them to stand out from the crowd, right? They like to kind of blend in with the crowd, but if you call them out, then they stand out. They become sort of at the center of attention. Everybody's looking at them, and then they're standing out from everybody else. And then they want to just go back to blending into the crowd, right? So to exist is to stand out from the cloud. Or if you've seen, what's that movie? Spider-Man 2? I think the Amazing Spiderman 2. the one with Jamie Foxx as Electro, right? And he's always saying, nobody sees me, nobody sees
I just wanted everyone to see me.
me. And then all of a sudden he becomes Electro, and everybody's looking at him, and he's like, I exist now. Everybody sees me. I am the center of attention, and he feels like he exists for the first time because he stands out.
Please! You see me? You see me? They see me.
Right? So to exist is to stand out. But the most important aspect of this is that existence itself is a mutually constitutive correlate. You can't exist unless there is something from which to stand out. Therefore, all of existence is mutually constitutive, right? You exist in relation to everything that is not you. You stand in relation to this and that, your neighbor, your parents, your children, your neighbors, your friends, your classmates. You stand in relation to others, and that relationship is what defines who you are, in part because you are not them, right? You are not your parents, you are not your siblings, you are not your friends, you are not your neighbors. Nevertheless, you are who you are because you have been shaped and are in relationship with your parents and your siblings and your neighbors and your friends and your teachers, etc., right? So, all of this is a way of saying that a subject, to be a subject, remember we're talking about fundamental ontology and the basic, principles of logic and rationality, these philosophical tools that we need in order to do philosophy or theology, or just really to think clearly and not be deceived by people who try to assign categories to us or to feed us traditional categories formulated by white men. To be a subject means to be in relation with other subjects or to other subjects, right? So in philosophical terms in the West, this is a newer idea in the West. This is a very ancient idea in Indian philosophy and most Eastern philosophy. But it's really kind of a new idea, and Western philosophy didn't come to us until really after, especially after Einstein. But it's been in the West, it's been in the East for a long time. But in the West, it's usually called intersubjectivity or something like that. Intersubjective ontology. We depend on one another for our existence. I exist because I stand out from you. I exist more fully because I know you or because I am the object of your concern. Even though I'm not an object, I am a subject, but my subjectivity arises mutually with you, right? To be a teacher and student are also mutually constitutive correlates, right? I can't be a teacher unless there are students. Right now I have to have faith that somebody's going to be watching these videos one day and actually learning from them, because otherwise I'm just a douche, talking to a camera. But in order to be a teacher, there must be some student there that is learning from this, right? So in a weird way, I only will become a teacher now in some future moment when there is a student who learns from what I'm talking about. That's weird, but nevertheless true. To be a subject means to be in relation with other subjects. So this is sometimes called intersubjective ontology. There's other names for it too. In German, there's this other philosopher that says Dasein ist Mitsein. Dasein, being there, is to be with others, right? To be there, to exist here. To be here, not be her, be here means to stand in relationship with others. There's another great philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, who said the other, my neighbor, my others call me into being from a height, right? The other calls me into being or enables me to be by through vocation, through attention, through seeing, through acknowledging, by allowing me to be a subject, right? So my neighbor calls me into being from a height, so I depend on my existence by virtue of my neighbor's viewing me. What does all this have to do? I know this is some heavy philosophy, and usually you teach an entire course to try and get you to wrap your heads around this kind of stuff. Why am I trying to teach it super fast as just a portion of a larger, lecture on philosophical tools? Well, one reason is we really need to think about what does it mean to be, and what does it mean to be a subject in the world, and recognize that our subjectivity is inextricably linked and tied up with the existence of others in our environment, in our world, right? I can't be unless I am. I can't be unless I be in a world, right? To be is to be in a world with others, right? So as soon as I recognize that I exist in a ecosystem, in an ecology, in a cosmos or a world or a system of intersubjective relationships which mutually constitute one another. So we are who we are in relation with one another. Okay, we are not done with this. We will come back to mutually constitutive correlates with some regularity throughout the course, but I hope that when we do, maybe you will come back, put your little thumbprint or whatever, your fingerprint, bookmark, this section of the lecture, and you can always come back and rewatch this. Maybe it will make more sense later or upon repeated listenings, or maybe it won't. But for now, let's take a quick mental break, and while I erase the board, and we'll try to wrap all this stuff up together.